Day one of the World Rapid Championship has now completed in Warsaw, Poland, and what a day we had. Some exceptional games, and I will show the standings of the tournament after day one at the end of this video. But the game I want to look at today was played between Alireza Firouzja and Nihal Sarin, both rising stars. Firouzja 18 years old, Sarin 17 years old, so this really was a great clash between two child prodigies. So we had d4 from Firouzja today, which is interesting. He loves e4, but he goes in for actually a Catalan line, which is quite trendy at the moment following the World Championship match. So we had these standard opening moves here, and after castles from both players, black took on c4 here, a very common way to play. We had queen to c2, and now an interesting move that's kind of trendy at the moment, pawn to b5. Just instantly striking here, protecting that pawn. More common is actually to play pawn to a6. So pawn to b5, and now we had this a4 break, undermining this pawn chain. And you're forced to push on here, because if you protect like this, we just take. There's a pin here, so you can't do that. If you try going with c6, again, you can take, and knight g5 is very powerful. So you open up this bishop, and if you try and block with knight d5, which is very standard, now you run into this checkmate here. So coming back here, that's why after pawn to a4, we had pawn b4 pushing on. Now we had knight f to d2. You could come with the other knight, that has been played as well, but you're basically looking to take back this pawn with a knight, and you also open up the bishop by coming with the f knight. Now we had knight to d5, a very standard way to block that dangerous diagonal. Knight takes on c4, and now pawn to c5 from black, a really standard break in these structures because you don't want to be stuck with this backwards c7 pawn, which could be a problem later on. And after this captures here, we have bishop to a6 now from Nihal. So a really nice idea which Magnus popularised in 2019 in a game that he won against Ding Liren. And the idea is, as black, you're going for rapid development here. You don't want to take this pawn back straight away with the bishop, because now you're moving that piece twice. It looks slightly tactically vulnerable here on c5. And the main reason is that you actually want your knight to recapture that pawn on c5. So that's why we have bishop a6 instead. Now white actually plays a really nice retreating move, knight to e3. So you're putting pressure on this knight on d5, and you don't want to capture here as black, or you help white develop a piece, and look at these bishops, you're actually losing in exchange here. So instead black seeks to continue developing with knight to d7, and you do allow this knight to be taken on d5, but white doesn't take this pawn here. It's not the best way to play because now you get rook c8. And although black is 2 pawns down here, you're soon going to be rounding up this pawn, and then you'll have tons of pressure on the white position in compensation for your second pawn. We can see that these pieces just still aren't developed here. So that's why instead, after this knight was captured and the pawn retook, we had pawn to c6 now. Although you neglect the development of these pieces for just a moment, you do stop black from just taking back this pawn in a comfortable manner. Black plays rook to c8 here, and now we had bishop to f4 developing. So knight to c5 here, continuing on with that plan, and now rook to d1, and we now had this sequence. So pawn to d4, black doesn't want to allow white to just take on d5 comfortably. Now we had pawn to h4, trying to secure the bishop. We saw in that game between Magnus and Ding that this bishop got kicked around. Pawn to h6 now, giving the king some room and perhaps toying with the idea of going g5. Now bishop to f3, just improving that piece, defending this pawn, which we note is attacked by this one and could be double attacked if a rook comes to the e-file, and we give the king a square here on g2. So we now had rook to e8, knight to d2 from white, and now pawn to d3 because the rook has been blocked. Good move. And now after Firouzja recaptures, we have bishop takes on d3, the queen comes back to c1, and bishop to f8 now at this point, opening up the rook. So white has to be a bit careful here. We can see that these pieces are quite congested at the moment, and somehow white needs to develop these heavy pieces on this side of the board. So that's why we had rook to e1, contesting this file and just trying to give the queen some room to actually come in this direction. Queen to f6 now development. rook takes on e8, the rook recaptured, and now we had pawn to c7. And this is a nice move because Nihal now plays the best move in the position, which is rook c8, and it allows Firouzja to free up his queen by bringing it to the e-file. And we note that black can't take on b2 here, or bishop e5 actually traps that queen. Really nice tactic there. So instead bishop d6 was played, challenging this strong bishop and then looking to pick up this pawn. So we had this series of exchanges here. The rook came to the open c-file and black recaptured this pawn. Again, note that this one can't be taken, or there's tactics here which black is running into. The rook can come to c6 now, and after the queen moves away, say to d7, we're centralising the queen really powerfully. So that pawn on a4 is just not one you want to be grabbing. Instead, black captures here. We now had queen e8 check, king h7, queen e3, and now bishop f5, good move. Nihal just takes care of this slightly loose bishop. Again, if he tries to win this pawn, well, this just isn't working tactically because of this sequence of moves, and now the bishop hangs on d3. So that's why this one drops back into f5. We now had pawn to a5 because this pawn genuinely was attacked. Knight into e6 now, good move. Looking at this key d4 square. The rooks came off, queen recaptures, and knight to b3 now. Again, just improving the knight, looking at these squares. We had queen to c4 here from Nihal, and king to g2 from Firouzja. King g8, improving the king, and knight to d2 now, putting the question to the black queen. So here Nihal goes ever so slightly wrong. Probably best would have been something like, say, queen to c7. Just keeping the queens on the board, keeping an eye on this pawn, looking at this one, and probably best for white here is knight to b3. And then it begs the question, what would Firouzja have done after queen to c4? If you go back, you're just repeating the position here. But instead of this, Nihal actually played queen into c5 here after knight to d2. And this allows Firouzja to exchange here and go into a slightly better endgame after this move, bishop to d5. It's a bit uncomfortable to face, and that's why Nihal now played bishop to e6, just trying to challenge that powerful centralised bishop. But after Firouzja takes here, he can't actually take back the knight, or else king f3 is really powerful, marching rapidly into the centre. And look at these weak pawns which black has here. Although white also has some weak pawns, we note that from c4 the knight will protect them really well. So that's why Nihal takes with the pawn here, which is the best move, but now we can see his pawn structure is really quite compromised. So Firouzja now plays his king into f3, we have king to f7, king to e3, pawn to e5 though now, good move from Nihal, taking away these squares, and in combination with the knight, it forms a barrier for the king here. So knight to e4, and knight to b3 from Nihal. Keeps the knights on the board, attacks this pawn, it's a good move. Pawn to a6 from Firouzja, and now king to e6, Nihal brings his king in. So pawn to g4 from Firouzja, he wants to try and get a passed pawn going on the king side if he can, possibly in combination with a knight coming to f5 and attacking these two. So king to d5, good move, knight to g3, and now pawn to g6. So Nihal didn't have to play this way, but he wants to keep the knight out of this key f5 square. He could have also played knight to d4, but pawn to g6, pawn to h5 from Firouzja, desperately wants access to that square. We had captures, captures, and now knight to d4, again controlling this square. And now pawn to f4 from Firouzja, really nice break, just pushing for the win, pushing as he so often does. Nihal could have actually captured here, and again this is still a level position, but instead he goes for this move, check first, the king moves away, and then he captures this pawn. And what he's looking for here is that after knight f5, he now gets knight d4, challenging this knight, and even though it takes on h6, he's saying that, okay, you've got the passed h-pawn, but I've got the passed f-pawn. Who's really better? Look at my centralised pieces. So knight to g4 now from Firouzja, good move. He tries to stop the f-pawn, but also free up the way for his own h-pawn. Now we have knight to f3 check. And what Nihal is trying to do is check and jump into g5 because he now controls this key square that the pawn wants to head down. Knight to f2 now from Firouzja. The king sidesteps to d4. We had pawn to h6, pawn to f3 with check, king to d2. And now there was one move that Nihal had to find to keep things balanced, which was pawn to b3. And the idea is that you maintain this opposition with the white king here, you don't let it into e3, and if white tries something like, say, knight to g4, well, you can just drop back to, say, h7, and you maintain this hopping here. White could do similar, but it's hard for either side to make progress. But instead we had king to c4, a fatal mistake because it allowed king to e3, and this king is now marching in. So the king comes to b5, knight to d3 hitting this one, so pawn to b3, king to f4, and this is the problem now. The black knight is just getting kicked all over the place. We had king takes on a6, and now king f5. The white king is marching in. We had king to b5, king to f6, king to c4, and even king takes here is still good, but instead knight to f2, really simple move. Nihal drops the knight back to the corner, king g7, king d4, king takes, king e3, but now knight h1 and Nihal threw in the towel. The pawn can't advance or it will be taken, and this white pawn's going through. So an epic game there between those two young players and a really enjoyable final round. And this is the standings at the end of day one. So we can see that Carlsen, Duda and Jabava are clear ahead on 4.5 points, but then there's a big chasing pack which includes Firouzja as well as many other strong players. So I'm really looking forward to covering day two, and if you never want to miss a video, then do hit here to subscribe. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.